Hello, people. I see 5 people here today. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So I'm hearing that you guys have your exciting crit on Tuesday, right? Did I get that right?
Yes, sir.
All right. So I guess that is the reason for the dwindling class numbers and not the hurricane. All right. Well, guess what? What I had done is that we would have a much shorter class today anyway. So all the better. All the better. All right. Um we are moving to a new topic today, right? We're going to be going into Illustrator, right? And we're going to just touch a little bit, as usual, for this review class. I'm going to touch a little bit on Illustrator. We're going to check out a interesting kind of intro to Illustrator, where it all started. And then we're going to jump right into the exercise, right? Now, for this class, I'm going to post the exercise, right? Because what happened is that for the earlier class, there's actually a storm close by me, and I think it had knocked out the internet at some point, right? So what happened is that somehow I lost the early morning recording, right? But not to worry. I have I'm just gonna just load the tutorial for that class. And the other aspect of the class that we had discussed, I'm gonna discuss it with you now, so you wouldn't have lost anything, right? Right. So um I'm seeing 3 people. Are you guys ready for crit? Or are you only half here? Honesty is the best policy, right?
Not ready for the crit, but still showing up for the class.
Ah, commendable. I should be giving away like a prize. And then you know, and then the other classmates would be jealous. But let me tell you, this is a part of architecture, right? I know that studio is the reason for breathing, but on the other hand, you still have to pass the other modules, right? And when you guys go on to do the masters, right? Because I figure you guys are going to the top and nothing less, right? So when you do that, you're gonna find that it gets even more challenging. And at that professional level, you most definitely cannot be skipping class. So it's good practice, right, guys? We are going to move into an exercise. You have some advantages for you guys. The first advantage is that, as you know, some of the exercises are pre-recorded. However, some of the lecturing sessions are not. So, it's good and it's bad. So what I wanted to talk about today is going to be vector. So we're actually going into a new topic, and that would be Illustrator, right? Anybody here have Illustrator installed?
Yes, sir.
All right. Okay, so um let me ask this other question. Anybody here have used the Illustrator?
Like
No?
once.
Like once. Okay, cool. All right, like when you use it once, Davison, from that little taste that you got, that little taste mouth of Illustrator, what did you make of it?
I still don't understand it.
Well, guess what? This is the mystery of Illustrator. And what happens is that sometimes it falls in the shadow of Photoshop, right? Because Photoshop, the word Photoshop is almost a part of our culture already, right? We say, oh, that girl looks so good, it looks like she's Photoshopped. That guy looks so good, it looks like he's Photoshopped. Like it's literally a part of the way that we describe things. But we don't do that with Illustrator or the other apps, right? It's so what happens is that most of the other apps kind of falls in the shadow of Photoshop. And then it becomes to be this question like, okay, so why do we need to use Illustrator again? I mean, Photoshop is the king, so why do we need to use InDesign? Photoshop is the king. And this is why we have this course, this module, Digital Design Media, because we want to make sure we lay the foundation to know that Photoshop is just one of the, I call it the ultimate trifecta, right? And it's not even like the strongest one. As I would argue that for architecture, you probably will find more use out of Illustrator than Photoshop. Unfortunately, most people only discover this when they're about to leave CSC, and they're just like, oh, all those years that I struggled doing this thing and I could have used a different program. They don't. So I want you guys to avoid that, and I want to see if I can give you a good introduction to why would you want to use Illustrator, right? Now we're going to do 2 exercises with Illustrator. So one is for today, and the other will be for next class. But before we dive into that, I want to just show you a little bit about Illustrator so that we can kind of pinpoint what exactly is Illustrator. So we're going to go from the start, and I'm going to bring that up right about now. Just give me 1 second here. Can you guys hear the audio okay? Oh, but you're not seeing the screen. My bad. All right. Could you guys hear the audio a while ago?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
All right, cool.
Illustrator really changed things way back. It started making the computer a real graphics tool.
I think I just saw the future, and it just was really exciting to me. I just wanted to learn it.
You've never seen anything do something like this before. You can make changes and things would happen instantaneously. It's like magic.
So I'm the classically trained graphic designer. I did rub down text. That's sort of like bear skins and stone knives.
So does anybody recognize any of these objects here?
Yes, sir.
So give me some now. What do we see? Tell me something of what I'm looking at.
I mean, French curve.
A French curve, like a fine liner, exacto knife, two
I hear compass.
crayons, circle templates.
All right, cool. I don't hear anybody say French curve.
Oh no, Antonio said that.
Oh, okay. Sorry, it's true. Everybody talk one time. Right. So notice what the guy said at the beginning. He said that, you know, I'm like the classic, I'm coming from a classic graphic artist where like, you know, chisel and stone knives, you know, like caveman days. But guess what? You guys did hand drawings in first year. You did perspective, you did all these things. When I was in architecture, I did it for the first 2 years, right? It was in third year that we got to use whatever technology that we wanted to use, right? And the thing about it is, what a lot of persons will recognize is that in the graphic design world, when I say the word graphic designer to you, what comes to mind? Anybody? What comes to mind? A what?
The manipulation of text and images to communicate an idea.
Cool. Anybody else?
I think about logos.
Okay, cool. And the interesting thing is that most of us kind of have this idea that, okay, you know, graphic design, you know, it's like digital stuff and designing logos and all these things. But originally, graphic design was really, you could almost think of it as technical drawing. Anybody heard of TD? Know about TD? Remember TD?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Right. And the thing about it is that, you know, the way that we grow up, maybe kind of local to the Caribbean and so forth, when it comes to in our leading up to architecture, this kind of built profession, chances are some of us did technical drawing where it's very technical, you know, we're drawing like screws and machine parts and that kind of stuff. But in the world of graphic design before computers, it's the same tools that had to be used to build things like signage and large format prints. And let's say it's a development that says coming soon, the Richmond. You know, those houses had to be drawn. There was no computer to print them out. The floor plans that you see on the billboard, they had to be drawn. How were they drawn? Just like what you did in first year. They were drawn using things like these. So this is kind of the classic graphic designer, which is very similar to the classic architect. But the architect, maybe we use more technical tools. We use a drawing table. The graphic designer also use a drawing table, but maybe not everything. But 90% of the tools are very similar. It's just that one is more technical based and one is a little bit more creative.
I used French curves and rulers.
The process of getting camera-ready art was pretty involved back in the day. You had multiple elements. This is a really old piece that was done before computers.
It was really time intensive. You would sketch out a comp with all the measurements, and then you'd lay out your page. Copy had to be spec'd. What kind of typeface are you going to use? What point size?
The text was spit out from a typesetter, which was cut up and pasted onto the boards.
One page of set type, it might take a day or 2 days to actually do.
The rapidograph.
You know what repeatographs are, that pen that always clogs up and spits.
It stains clothes, it stains your hands.
The rapidograph decides to explode. Anything could go wrong.
When your hand is just doing the final little touch and all of a sudden you jerk and it's ruined and you'd have to start all over again.
I'm just so pleased that I never have to struggle through that again. John Warnock always had a vision in his mind of Adobe Illustrator existing. I just don't think the technology was there. The computer wasn't there.
I had joined Xerox in 1978, and their goal was to make the office of the future. We had text editors, email, networks, we had laser printers. What they didn't have is graphic engines that could make sort of arbitrary graphics. They were computer scientists, and they were imagining what computer scientists wanted to do. They weren't imagining what the world was trying to do from a creative point of view, and they were simply not making tools to address that community.
One time I was at a conference listening to John speak, though, and he said the reason he invented Illustrator was because his wife couldn't ink. I know he meant it very kindly, but...
I think Marva and her graphic design background influenced John to venture into the world of graphic arts and to solve problems for graphic designers.
The very first thing we collaborated on was radial corners.
Letraset had corners that were pre-done, and if you needed a specific radius that they didn't have, you were out of luck. She would say, I need a rectangle that's this size with this radial corner, and I would fill in a couple of parameters and print it. And trying to figure out how to do that on the computer was really critical to the design of PostScript.
John Warnock and Chuck Geschke invented PostScript because there was something missing in the industry. There was bitmap typefaces and bitmap images. There was lots of languages driving printers, so they wanted to come up with the universal language which would drive a printer of any make, any model, now and into the future. And that was an amazing vision.
If it wasn't for PostScript, there would be no desktop publishing. It sort of opened the doors that you were able to produce layouts and magazines.
PostScript was a page.
Let me ask you guys another question that's coming up.
Page description language, and you use this language to describe how to draw the page. The description of the objects are all vectors and curves. The major breakthrough with PostScript is that you could have any size type. You could stretch it and squash it and do anything you wanted to it. It could deal with images, it could deal with graphics, but you had to be a programmer to actually do it. There weren't any applications to drive it.
So let me ask you guys this question, right?
Bitmap images. There was lots of languages driving printers, so they wanted to come up with the universal language.
All right. Now, if you look at this, I want to ask you guys, where are you? Where did you go? All right, there we go. I lost it. There we go. So can you guys tell me why is it that this letter looks like this? What are these squares that are here? These that look like steps. What are they? Anybody?
The pixels.
Exacto mundo. So remember last class that we had, we took a look on, right. So we took a look on some images and there we go. You guys remember this image, right? We don't forget about it already. And remember, we're asking ourselves, what makes an image sharp? And we kind of demystify that and we realize that, what really makes an image sharp is your experience of it, right? So this is okay. I can't recognize the pixels here, but if I zoom in far enough, I will be able to see those pixels, right? And then you guys can see those pixels, right? Now, it's fine because what pixels are finite. No care how much pixels you cram into a picture, you can always zoom in until you see them. So what that means is that how you perceive them will determine whether or not it's blurry. The fact of the matter is that to display anything on a digital device, it has to use pixels. That's just the reality. Now, if you look on these examples here, you can see where the pixels actually are. And this was the language of how graphics used to be done. It's done with pixels. And if it's too pixelated, then that means you are looking at the thing too close, or we need to cram more pixels in it. Now, one of the big change that Illustrator came up with is that instead of pixels, it uses a kind of formula. Anybody here remember maths when we do vectors in maths? Anybody remember vectors? When you plot the vectors on the graph sheet and you get the question and it say, all right, draw a vector between points, x 23, y 24, and and you need to just plot that graph. That is what a vector is. And what they discovered is this script called PostScript. And essentially what it does is instead of using pixels to show information, it uses coordinates. And that is what you're looking at here. Now, I could tell you to draw a curve and give you the exact coordinates, and maybe you could draw that up. It will maybe take you a while, but the computer can do that in nanoseconds. And that is essentially what this image is. This image is just a bunch of instructions that looks like this. And all the computer is doing is plotting a curve and line work according to the instructions that is here. Now, that is very different when compared to producing a bitmap image, right? And bitmap means pixels. Whether we say bitmap or we say raster image, it's the same. A bitmap is made up of pixels. Now, whenever we use Photoshop, there we go. Right, whenever we use Photoshop, the only way Photoshop can represent information is by putting little squares together and they all come together to form the image. Illustrator, on the other hand, uses vectors and formulas, and we're going to take a look on what kind of difference that made. And if I show you this, for example, where I say, let's get a blank paper here, and I can go to text and I could write my name. Photoshop is representing all of this information, but it is representing it as pixels, as bitmap. And if I zoom in far enough, sure enough, you can see it has to use these squares to represent the information. Now, on the other hand, if I use Illustrator, oops. Did I close it? I think I did. Right, I think I did. So if I use Illustrator, on the other hand, it's not going to use pixels anymore, but instead, what it will do, it uses vector information. And what does that mean? Well, simply put, I'm just going to pull this over here, and I will pull Photoshop over here. There we go. And if I look at this B here, Photoshop is using pixels to represent this curve. But Illustrator is using vectors to represent this curve. Now, both of them are zoomed in the same amount. This is zoomed in at about 2000%, and this is also zoomed in at about 2000%. Let me zoom it in. Yeah, about that. Now, clearly you guys see the difference, right? Everybody, you can see the difference on your screen, right?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Right, and that is the beauty of using vectors to represent graphics instead of pixels, because you always have to break the information down in squares to show something graphical. But this was the revolution of Illustrator, because it didn't have to break down information in squares. Instead, it represented it as formulas. The challenge with this is that in the beginning, you had to be a programmer to be able to manipulate this. If you wanted this curve to be a different degree, you would have to know coding, and you go in the code and say, okay, let the vector go through x equals this and blah, 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 and in order for you to get the curve. And that was the initial challenge of Illustrator.
Language, and you use this language to describe how to draw the page. The description of the objects are all vectors and curves. The major breakthrough with PostScript is that you could have any size type. You could stretch it and squash it and do anything you wanted to it. It could deal with images, it could deal with graphics, but you had to be a programmer to actually do it. There weren't any applications to drive it. We started development in 1985 of Illustrator.
Mike Schuster was the very first programmer on the product. He's clicking and dragging and creating a Bezier curve. I was pretty amazed by that.
It was a direct translation of how people drove PostScript.
Now, this is the thing about Illustrator, right? Think about it. You come from the days of drawing curves with a French curve. Like if you wanted to get a particular curve, you had to rotate that French curve in a particular way to get it. Anybody here use French curve? Everybody here use French curve, right? You must in first year, maybe. Anybody here that has never used a French curve? Okay, I guess that is nobody. And when you use the French curve, you have to kind of move the French curve around to get a particular curve. Now, let me go back to the Photoshop example here, right? And Illustrator. The thing is that when we are using Photoshop, now let's say, for example, the edge of this B, instead of curving it like that, I say, okay, I want to curve the B like that. I want to have a little intimacy curve right here, right? Let me just draw that better. Forgive me, I'm drawing with the mouse. And you want to get a little intimacy curve there. Now, the only way to do that in Photoshop is that you need to create more pixels in order to generate that curve. So what you find that you have to do, maybe you have to use a brush tool, and let's see here. I'm going to go to the layers. I'm going to create a new layer, and then let's make this a little smaller. And then you have to kind of brush in some tools there and do something like that, right? And that's how you would end up getting the curve with pixels, right? But on the other hand, using Illustrator is kind of like using a digital French curve, because I can just move these are called Bezier curves, and I could just extend this down, and all this is doing is manipulating the formula in real time. And look at that, like this is fully editable, and it is 100% sharp. So this was the beauty of Illustrator, is that you are able to get accurate graphic design, right? So we're not necessarily talking about architecture here. We're talking about art in general. anything from a building in 3D or building that is drawn to an advertisement sign. This was the revolution that Illustrator did.
But you didn't have to program. It would just emit the PostScript code that would make the drawing for you. It gave you very, very precise control, which I knew from Marva's work you needed. You had to have it. When Illustrator went into beta, I wanted to do a drawing that would express something that you absolutely couldn't program. I drew on a piece of tracing paper a picture of a rose, but then I executed it in Illustrator. When people saw that this was the kind of thing that you could do with Illustrator, they just went bonkers. They thought that was fantastic.
It was just revolutionary.
Just before Illustrator came out, I had to come up with some demo files to show it off. And I saw some work being done by an artist by the name of Ron Chan in San Francisco, who did everything in an Illustrator-like fashion, but he did it with ink and pen and colored overlays. So he's a great candidate for someone who should be using Illustrator.
Basically, the whole project was just to produce this one piece of artwork of this nurse with a French curve. It was such a simple program at that time. It didn't have any undo commands, so anytime I made a mistake, the guy that was with Russell would come over and go into the code and erase the code and say, okay, you can start off again. We were just trying to get the thing to work.
So we scan in this reference art, and he does this illustration of this nurse, and there's big dots all over, so she looks like a Liechtenstein, print. If I only known about Adobe Illustrator, and there's a tear coming down her eye.
January of '87, we came out with the first version of Illustrator.
We're now a software company, and we have products like Adobe Illustrator. That has to be packaged, it has to be promoted.
Because it was such a new kind of a product, I did a one-take video take and demoed the product.
I'm John Warnock, president of Adobe Systems, and I'd like to welcome you today to view a tape that we've prepared about Adobe Illustrator. It addresses the professional illustration market, and it has a lot of capabilities that you won't find in other programs.
I'd only been at Adobe for a few months, and Russell said, here, design the packaging for Illustrator. So I started thinking about classical art and the Renaissance, and I saw the painting of Botticelli's Venus, and I thought, that's the one.
I was sold. I was sold the minute I saw it. It was that ability to manipulate curves that really got me, because curves are very important, especially if you're designing type. Traditionally, I wanted that curve, and I wanted to give it a little more curve. If it wasn't right, I have to white it out and start again. Whereas in Illustrator, I could just grab it and move it.
I saw the potential for what I did in it. That's what got me excited about it. I started creating TV book covers at the Chronicle on the computer, on a Mac, using Illustrator. I started doing more and more complex things. It would always be crashing the rip of DPI. This is the one that crashed the rip.
Back then, this was all fairly new stuff, and people were very resistant to the whole idea of going digital.
This concept of a computer that could draw these shapes for you, we were introducing a whole new way of thinking.
There were a lot of people that were very skeptical, so we did this video of me jumping out of an airplane as sort of the metaphor of here's how scary it is to go outside your comfort zone.
So what this was basically, when I just started CSA, I came in right around that transition into AutoCAD, right? And initially, a lot of persons were skeptical, especially persons that are used to hand drawing, right? Because the question is, can AutoCAD do all of these things? And now we are even moving beyond AutoCAD and we're going to BIM. But that revolution was also happening in the graphic industry as well, right? Here are the things that we used to do with French curves and all of these things. And then here comes this program to now aid the design process. So this is why some persons were skeptical of the Illustrator.
This perfect line. And so here I come along, I'm trying to evangelize the process of using Adobe Illustrator. I search for some of the best designers out there, and I bring them to invitationals I'm putting on. We set up Adobe Illustrator, brought these skeptics into the room, and changed their whole lives.
We called it influencing the influencers, and it was really, really effective. We had some amazing artists. David Hockney came. Key figures in publishing like Life and Time, New York Times.
We introduced this technology to Time magazine, and boom! Every infographic at Time magazine is now being done in Illustrator.
If you guys know about infographics, it's informational graphics, and it's actually something that we do in architecture as well. And this is one of the major advantages of Illustrator, because things like maps and elevations and plans and anything that requires illustration and has to do with line work, this is where Illustrator shines.
Came up with the printing press. Illustrator, it really has changed the world, and it's changed the way graphic designers work and the art that's been created. And it's absolutely precise and perfect and adjustable.
What people have been able to do with Illustrator is just astounding. Everybody said you're going to ruin good design because now anybody can do it. But the cream rises to the top.
I hope you guys heard that, right? And this is always something that is said, especially about computing work, right? Just because anybody has access to the same amount of buttons that the other person have access to, it doesn't mean that everyone will now become experts. And the same is true that even people who are not experts at Illustrator or Photoshop, it's not about that. It's about how you use it, right? And this introduction module is just kind of showing you the buttons to press. But as I said, the cream rises to the top. Like, it is the ideas that you have and you want to express, and then you let the buttons do your bidding. Not knowing what all the buttons do and then hopes that it does your layout or your sheet layout for you. It's the other way around, right? So what I want to do, I want to show you some examples of how Illustrator is used for those of you that are probably never used Illustrator before and you're wondering, okay, fine, so it can do all these awesome things. What are some examples of how this is used? I'm going to show you two here, and then I'm going to open the program to show you another one, right?
When I am just pointing and clicking away and endlessly manipulating Bezier curves. My chosen medium is Adobe Illustrator. It's the thing I feel most comfortable in, and I think I probably wouldn't be doing what I do if I didn't have that as a tool. If you see me hold a pencil, I hold it like a 5-year-old holds a crayon. It's really ridiculous. There's very different ways to work digitally. You can work digitally and still work in a very hand-hewn, handmade human way. Most of the work that I do by hand with lettering is really just part of my process of creating on the computer. My sketches are really just notes, so they don't have to be beautiful. I'll just take an iPhone photo of the sketch, and then I usually just drop that into an artboard in Illustrator to actually get the vector work in there. Daily Dropcap was my first major project that I did that was sort of me putting myself out there and creating something online. I would draw a letter every single day and work my way through the alphabet 12 different times. Drop caps sort of came from this tradition of illuminated manuscripts. I really thought about all of these letters as being these like illustrative initial caps that you could put into your blog. It got traction almost immediately, and so much came from it. Most recently, this Penguin Drop Caps project, in which I'm doing 26 classic books. They created a dream project for me at Penguin, which is pretty amazing.
So you realize that even though Illustrator is done on the computer, and even though it's technical where you're manipulating curves and all these things, you can still combine hand drawings, and use Illustrator to digitize your line work and then add more creativity to it, right? And you know, in architecture, you do a lot of concept design, right? And that is the part that I want us to try out. And that's the first exercise that we're going to actually do. We are going to be digitizing a sketch. Now, I want to show you another example of using Illustrator here.
I consider Illustrator my pencil on the canvas. It's how I plan my paintings. I create the basic elements in Illustrator, and then Photoshop becomes the paint on top of those vectors. I tried many different angles and I could just never capture Times Square. And then when these giant printers came out, I realized that was the way to show Times Square. It has to be big like the place itself. The actual perspective.
Now, if you look on this, you remember everybody here did their perspective drawings in first year, right? Anybody here enjoyed perspective drawings? No, nobody enjoyed it? Okay. It sounds like Alex either say enjoy it or didn't. Hold on, let me make sure I can hear you guys. Yeah. You were saying something, Alex?
I was saying that sometimes I do enjoy it.
And I wonder if you remember, Alex, when you're doing your perspective drawing, and usually you draw out these cages to have guidelines for where you put building and how you put entourage and all these things, right? And depending if it's a 1 point, 2 point, or 3 point perspective, but you would use these guidelines. So what this artist is saying, how he does his visualizations of places, including buildings and people, is that he lays out the framework. Remember, we're talking about computers here, right? So it's not like you have the paper in front of you, but you have your artboard in front of you on the computer, and you lay out all of the guidelines in Illustrator. So things like the framing of a typical building, things like the height of a typical person, the perspective lines, all of that you lay out in Illustrator. Then you take that Illustrator into Photoshop, and this is the beauty of this thing because you can combine them together. And in Photoshop, if enabled what's called digital painting, right? So just like how you have physical painting where you have a paintbrush and a palette, you have digital painting where you have like a iPad. There were some persons who use like, it wasn't Sketchbook Pro. What was the other one again? Procreate. Anybody use Procreate? So that is a digital painting app. And what it did is paint on top of the guidelines. If you can see here, you can see how the perspective is laid out, but just the cage or the construction lines, the guidelines, because Illustrator is excellent at doing those guidelines. If you remember from your perspective drawing days, those guidelines had to be accurate because those are what guide the rest of the artwork. So this is another way that you can use Illustrator. Now, I want to show, by the way, guys, if you want to finish watching this, it is on the website. Just scroll down a little bit more and you will see the Illustrator story because it has very interesting stuff in it. But I want this class to be a bit quick. I know you guys have your crit going to on Tuesday. So you guys can finish watching that in your time. I want to show you this example real quick here, right? And if you take a look here, I'm going to show you, here's a picture here. Nice vehicle. Not the newest of vehicles. Then I want to show you this other picture here. Now let me view it in. There we go. And I'm waiting for you guys to ask me a particular question, all right? So based on what we watched so far, anybody have any questions about Illustrator and Photoshop based on what we look on so far? Anybody? Okay, no? I want you to look on these two pictures, right? What's the difference? How would you describe how these two pictures differ? Because they're the same vehicle. Not in terms of that one has the logo and one doesn't, right? But in terms of how it looks. How would you describe this?
They're done from two different perspectives.
Okay,
One
cool.
is lower to the ground and the next one is more mid-level.
Cool. What about how it looks? I mean, I know one has a background and one doesn't have a background, but apart from that, like if you look on them, I'm gonna turn up the quality on the share
The
screen.
Illustrator, the one of them is drawn, more like digitally created.
All right, cool, cool. What you say, Mia? What's your ideas on these two drawings in terms of how they look? Mia, are you there? All right.
The time is 8 p.m.
What about Mohammed? Are you there, Mohammed? No, Mohammed not here. I mean, here. He's here, but maybe not here. Who else
Sir,
is here?
can I answer?
Say again?
Sir, can I answer, Alexia?
Sure. Yeah.
The picture without the background kind of looks more pixelated compared to the one with the background.
Okay, cool. And the interesting thing, right. The interesting thing about this is the one on the left is a photograph and the one on the right is an illustration, right? And that's how we describe work done in Illustrator. We describe them as illustrations. Now, of course, I could zoom all the way in and you would definitely see those, you could definitely see those pixels, right? And of course, if I zoom into the one that's done in Illustrator, like it don't matter how much you zoom in, you will never see any pixels. But if I kind of zoom out a little bit and you look at them, the one thing that Illustrator, the reason why we still work with pixels and not just work with with vectors is, I want you guys to answer that question. Who can answer that question first? Like, why don't we just have cameras that can just generate stuff in vectors then, where we would never have to worry about an image being blurry? Because no matter how much you zoom in, it will be sharp. So anybody can tell me why that isn't so?
Sorry, ask the question, please.
Why is it, since pixels deals with squares and it's blurry, there's a limit to how much you can zoom into an image. But vectors, there is no limit. You can zoom all the way into this vector image here. It will always be 100% sharp. But if you zoom into this image here that's done with pixels, you will eventually hit the mark where it starts to get blurry. So my question to you, which I was hoping somebody would ask, is this: okay, why don't we just use vectors all the time? Why use pixels any at all?
So because with pixels, they can work with real images.
All right. Your answer is getting warmer. Okay. Anybody else? Why do we still use pixels? Why isn't everything not just vectors? Or
vectors use more space or processing capability?
But let me ask this question. Which one of these images looks more real?
The one with the background.
The one with the background. And that is precisely the answer. Pixels has the ability to give you photorealistic results. If you notice the image on the right, an illustration will not look as photoreal. So this is, for example, why cameras, you use pixels. You're looking at a photograph, they will use pixels because pixels give the flexibility of portraying information in a realistic form. But vectors will always look, kind of like a cartoon. It looks like an illustration, right? You can see here the way that the shadows, I mean, yes, the vector has shadows as well, but the way that the light bounces and reflects, you just know that it looks more real. Whereas the one on the right looks more like an illustration. It doesn't look photoreal. And this is the reason why we still use graphics, where we still use pixels and bitmap images. We are limited by this pixel thing because at the end of the day, a bitmap image has its limits. But a vector image is forever. And you could edit. All of these are just a bunch of lines that you could edit, if you can see them. But on the other hand, this looks like a hodgepodge of pixels. But if you zoom out far enough, it comes together nicely. The vector is 100% sharp when it's close, and it's still 100% sharp when it's far, but it just doesn't have that realistic touch yet, because as you know, technology changes every day. But it's going to take a little bit for vectors to look like images. And guess what? If that happens, then you will see every device on this planet switch to vector. Because then they will always be 100% sharp, right? Now, that is one of the main differences, and that's why today we still use pixels, especially for photographs. But if I open this vehicle in Illustrator now, I am able to manipulate every line that's here, because that's all these are. They are really just a bunch of lines, right? Anyway, guys, this is one of the main reasons why we use vector work. And especially when it comes to architecture, we have things like floor plans and elevations to draw. And when we need to digitize our sketch, that is going to be the reason why we use it. Now, the exercise that we're going to tackle, I'm going to give you guys a preview of it, right? Let's go to computing, and then let us go to digital design media. And if we scroll down here, we're going to go to exercise 3. And what we're going to do in exercise 3 is that we're going to take this hand-drawn. Remember last time we took a hand-drawn and then we carried it into Photoshop and enhanced it. This time we're going to take this sketch. This is a concept sketch, and these are things that you would do normally. You want to show how your design works, how it is influenced by the site, all of that stuff. You would do a simple diagram like this. But what we're going to do is carry this diagram in Illustrator and get a more precise diagram like this one, and especially one that can be any size. Remember that Illustrator does not have a size limit. So if you did a little tiny sketch on a piece of paper, and it's a sketch of a concept, and you wanted that sketch to be bigger, you know, if you blow up that sketch, you know, it's going to be blurry. But if you enhance the line work and turn it into vectors, then you could print it as small as a business card or as big as a billboard. It will be 100% sharp, right? So we're actually going to test that out now. And for you guys, as per usual, you're going to go to the site and you're going to do this exercise. Now, the good news is I'm going to give you guys until Wednesday, because I know that you have your crit on Tuesday, and I know that some of us are trying to prepare for that. So I'm going to give you until Wednesday before I start to count down the marks for this one. All right. How you guys feel about that? Or you don't need it? You know, all right.
Yes, sir, we do need it.
Nah, man, sir, we'll take it.
We won't reject it. Not looking to give horse in the mouth.
All right, so that's what I'm going to do. Now, as usual, guys, when you go to the website, especially for those of you in the evening class, you're going to go to class recordings, right? And you go down to Intro to Digital Design Media, you choose the current year, and then you're going to choose the latest video. So the other one that's going to pop up here will be exercise 3, and that's the one that you're going to tackle. All right, guys?
Yes, sir.
All right, so good luck. Welcome to Illustrator, and we have one more Illustrator exercise next week. Now, next week's Illustrator is going to be a big one, so make sure you have your Illustrator. I would definitely suggest you do that one in class because things can go wrong, right? So, and then after Illustrator, we're going to move into 3D and we're going to start exploring SketchUp, right? So that's going to come week after next. Okay, guys?
Yes, sir.
All right. So until then, I wish you guys good luck in your design studio, all right? I see some submissions. You guys know how to check your grades already when they become available, right? So keep track of that. And I will see you again next week, Saturday. All right, guys?
Excuse me, sir.
Mm-hmm.
I sent you an email because one of the first assignment was missing for me, even though I sent it in. But I sent it to you tech emails. I didn't know if you saw it.
Okay. I probably saw it. What happened when you send an email? You send me a message to in the Zoom chat?
No, I didn't send any Zoom chat. I just sent an email.
Right. So I want you to just send a message to me in the Zoom chat because it's instant, right? And especially like if it's something that's missing that I can just check, just message me and I'll just check it same time. All right. So just message, not in the meeting chat, but in the Zoom, in the group chat that we created, but you can just message me directly.
So do I send it again or just?
Yeah, just message me again because that way I will just take a look on it same time.
Okay, sir.
All right, cool. All right. Okay, guys. All right, so that was it. So this one was a little bit short and I tried to keep it short for you, but we're going to expand a little more next week. So come armed to the teeth with your Illustrator in hand. All right. And I'll see you next week, Saturday. All right. All right, guys. Bye.